Sure, you've seen this before. Every time a new From Software game gets released, there's a huge discourse in the gaming sphere around difficulty. On a rare occasion, you might pop your head above the trenches and say, "You know what? I found this boss hard." And instantly you're shouted down with, "You probably didn't die to Ornstein and Smo because you decided to kill Ornstein first." Honestly, I find the Capra Demon ridiculously easy. I actually found Dancer to be one of the easiest, beat her first try. As someone who's beat every boss in the series aside from Sister Freed, I find it absolutely hilarious that you found the Dancer harder, and then, inevitably, they bring out the silver bullet and tell you you've just got to, and say it with me, Git Gud! Welcome to the deep dive, and today we're taking on the infamous question, do you need to get good? The original concept of gaming difficulty comes from days of the arcade machine, which while still around today, were the main way of gaming in the 80s and early 90s. Game companies found that the best way of extracting money from the young players, instead of making long games or games that you'd want to replay, they made games that were incredibly difficult instead. Games like Sinister, Mortal Kombat, Missile Command, and Ghosts and Goblins were designed to be easy enough to lure you in, then have a huge difficulty spike to make sure you had the right level of investment to want to play one more time.
One more game?
No. No more drinking. That's it.
Uno más?
Contra was a particularly interesting example of these arcade games because it introduced the famous Konami code. Originally created because the tester of the home port of the game called Gradius, Kazuhisa Hashimoto, found the game to be too difficult to finish. The Konami code is the first real example of an accessibility option in a difficult game. Simply entering this code at any time will grant you extra lives and a passing chance at completing the game. Or don't enter it and set your own level of challenge. As the gaming landscape changed and more people could afford home consoles, games began to shift in terms of their challenge. Whilst you still had sections that would even have parents pulling their hair out, I'm looking at you Disney's Aladdin and the Stampede section of Lion King, games were moving towards length rather than difficulty. The business drive behind this was for home rentals. The lack of memory storage on the consoles for save data meant if the game was long, you would have to rent it multiple times to get full completion. Upon the advent of the memory card, allowing for save data to be carried over between sessions on home console, much of the talk around difficulty ended up being around individual games that were very much a rarity, like Ninja Gaiden or Otogi, with the truly masochistic difficulties being present on more or less every game, but entirely optional for the hardcore players. Quite often in those days, the harder difficulties rewarded you with fun unlocks, cheat codes, or extra costumes to give you something back for submitting to the hardcore and often broken challenges they created. However, over time, sadly the gaming industry elected for you to pay for these unlocks instead of granting you them for gameplay. A good recent example of this being the Resident Evil remakes that let you pay for the infinite weapons you'd normally unlock through gameplay, although that option does still exist. Nowadays, the game series that comes to mind when people debate on the difficulty of games is From Software's fantastic series of action RPG titles dubbed the Soulsborne series. Released in February 2009, Demon's Souls was far from the first game From Software made, and despite the lack of vision the project had, was well received critically. Whilst the visuals were flat and brown for the most part, the core gameplay was something the designer and eventual product leader Hidetaka Miyazaki felt instilled a sense of pride and accomplishment in the player. Set in the cursed kingdom of Boletaria, Demon's Souls has you play as an unnamed hero, brought to the land in order to save it from the old one, who has used forbidden soul arts to create twisted demons. A novel idea at the time, the game centered around third-person action RPG mechanics, where you could build your own custom characters' looks and stats from the ground up. The majority of bosses in Demon's Souls had a gimmick or trick to beating them, but this didn't make the now iconic gameplay any easier. Whilst we got our dodge, parry and attack mechanics that are so prevalent today, the main takeaway here is the true and sort of hidden difficulty system at play, the world and character tendency mechanics. Character tendency affects the entire game, but only really affects quest items and a few certain weapons. World tendency, on the other hand, affects each individual biome of the levels of Demon's Souls. Being in white tendency makes the game easier, with fewer invading phantoms and enemies having less health, whilst being in black world tendency has you invaded by black phantoms, enemies deal more damage, and your total health is reduced. In the modern day, this system is often used by the Souls community to add an extra challenge, farm items or complete quests, but back at release, this obscure and unexplained system did nothing but frustrate and confuse players, namely because the death in human form, which often came at the hands of bosses, made the game harder, leaving people who were stuck even more stuck than before. Death in human form also meant you ended up playing with lost health, and unable to summon help in combat from other players, alongside dropping all of your souls, which act as both XP and currency in the game. The healing system revolved around various types of grass that could be consumed in order to restore health. The only issue with these items is they were finite, and not restored at checkpoints upon death, meaning if you got stuck on a section or a boss, you could easily run out of these items and have to go and farm them, creating a major headache for new or less skilled players. This essentially meant that players were actively being punished for playing badly at the game, and you'll know more often than not, the first time you fight a boss, it rarely goes your way. From Software's first stab at a difficulty curve definitely had its fans, but given they never went back to this tendency system again, shows they agreed with what the majority thought about it on release. Difficulty should be clear-cut and explained, rather than obscure. Credit where credit's due though, this was an innovative way to add difficulty. Rather than it just being a choice of 4 that didn't scale dynamically, it was just unfairly skewed for new and less skilled players. In order to mitigate this difficulty, a key staple in all of the Souls games are the summon signs and notes. These are 2 entirely different co-op features that allow the player to essentially choose their own level of help. The notes left by other players aren't always helpful and may offer some more than questionable advice, but more often than not they will warn you of an upcoming ambush or a boss weakness. The summon signs also sit as a beacon of hope to struggling players, as it allows to call in 2 other real-world players to help you finish sections of the game up until the defeat of the world boss. The next entry in the Souls series mixed things up in a significant way, with what is considered by a large portion of the community to be Miyazaki's finest game, the original Dark Souls.
I'm sorry.
Set in the dying world of Lordran, the original Dark Souls moves away from demons and gives us a world caught in an endless cycle of death and undeath, in which we are cursed and seek to free the world from the wheel. Gone were the different hub worlds and by extension, the tendency system. In its place was a sprawling, interconnected world and more mechanically complicated bosses. In the previous game, the penalty of death meant you were no longer in human form and had reduced health, but they had no in-world justification for the punishment. In Dark Souls 1, I feel like they had a more lore-centric reasoning behind your death mechanic, and they also made dying less impactful on the difficulty. The player character is a hollow, a being devoid of humanity after the endless cycles of rebirth thrust upon the world, and the curse of the Dark Soul has gripped your body, meaning when you die, you lose your sense of self. In gameplay terms, this means you lose the ability to summon other players, you look like beef jerky left out in the sun too long, and you lose your humanity points. These humanity points are what you use to summon players or kindle bonfires. For those who don't know, bonfires are the checkpoints of the Souls games, and where you refill your now infinite healing item, the Estus Flask. The flask removed any grinding for healing items, but there was a way to increase the Estus you carried. Kindling the bonfire allowed you to carry more Estus whenever you rested a specific bonfire, again allowing you to make specific areas easier or harder by choosing whether you kindle the area's bonfire or not. So, to compare death in Dark Souls to Demon Souls, the punishment was less in terms of reduced health, but you still lost the ability to seek help and dropped your XP. Whilst you could recollect the lost humanity points alongside your XP, it really raised the stakes for getting back to your bloodstain, as these points were how you made areas easier. From Software had made the penalty for death less severe, and allowed new ways to make the levels easier via the kindling mechanic, but they weren't done playing around in this space. Bosses, as I said before, were more mechanically difficult, and fights against more than one boss at a time started to increase. Who could forget the infamous Ornstein and Smough? Dark Souls 1 had what I believe to be the best balance between difficult areas and difficult bosses. The level design itself allowed for shortcuts to be made without losing too much progress upon death, although the less said about the infamous Blighttown, the better. For Dark Souls 2, the prepare to die meme, perpetuated by the full edition of the original game, had reached its full apex. A well-known fact is that instead of Hidetaka Miyazaki being the director of Dark Souls 2, it was actually Tomohiro Shibuya and Yu Tanemura. Due to the "this game is hard" meme of the original and the change in director, the third iteration of the Souls formula ended up being influenced by the more is better way of thinking, resulting in a staggering 32 bosses. Set in Drang Lake, Dark Souls 2 once again sees you as the chosen undead out to fix a dying world where everyone is inflicted with the curse of the dark sign, causing them to hollow and lose their humanity. Most people consider the areas of Dark Souls 2 the difficult part rather than the bosses, perhaps due to the lack of in-depth boss mechanics on display. Worth shouting out here is the crazy broken hitboxes of this game and the adaptability stat which likely contributed to the difficulty. If you never leveled adaptability like on my first playthrough of the game, you had the smallest amount of iframes on a dodge roll that were physically possible, meaning your window to dodge is much tighter. Adaptability also governs how fast you use healing items or raise your shield. What else, I hear you ask, did this third iteration of the Souls formula bring to the table for difficulty changes? Well, summoning, messages and bloodstains remained, as it was now considered a staple of the franchise, but hollowing took a new and somewhat terrifying format. Similar to Demon Souls, Dark Souls 2 used hollowing as a punishment for death that reduces your maximum health. However, in this game, every time you die, your health will continually shrink until you reach 50% of its max value. The only way to stop this gradual shrinking of max HP is to use a humanity item, which for new players is very rare. In this way, new players of the series can be alienated with the insane difficulty before they even reach the first boss. Needless to say, this mechanic was never revisited again. With this masochistic death penalty in place, Dark Souls 2 played around with the healing mechanics. Whilst the Estus Flask, the reusable healing item from the original Dark Souls, was back, this time there was no option to kindle the bonfires for more uses. Instead, Dark Souls 2 added in something that many, including myself, feel broke the game: life gems. Coming in a few different strengths, life gems restored HP over time and could be stacked when multiple were used at once. They were also so abundant you could almost make the Estus Flask obsolete. You could naturally choose to use them or not, making it another optional in-game difficulty slider. This was widely considered a game-breaking addition, and as such, we never saw life gems in any form again in the Souls series. Similar to the kindling mechanic in the original, Dark Souls 2 added something you could burn at the bonfires, the bonfire ascetic. Essentially what this item does is revive the area boss once you've beaten it, up all of the enemies, including said boss, to the next New Game Plus cycle and respawn all of the items. This is perfect for farming souls and getting boss items, but if like me you had no idea what this item did, you're in for a world of hurt. Something to note is this bonfire ascetic lasts the entire save file, so if you used it on a new game and made an area New Game Plus 1, when you finish and go to the New Game Plus 1 properly, that area becomes New Game Plus 2. It's an irreversible change to increase the difficulty of an area, which I don't feel is adequately explained at all. It is very innovative and a diegetic way of implementing a difficulty option, but I feel like the large majority of first-time players suffered for not knowing what they were buying into with this item. Another one that never saw the light of day again after Dark Souls 2.
Another one. Another one. Another one. Another one. Another one.
Regarding the bosses, the quality here, with there being so many, was massively hit and miss. For every Velstadt, Dark Lurker or Looking Glass Knight, there was a boatload of group fights. The Skeleton Lords, Belfry Gargoyles, Ruin Sentinels, Prowling Magus and Congregation, the list truly goes on. Due to the lack of complex boss mechanics, other than throwing multiple enemies at you at once, and the introduction of life gems, it felt like a huge step in the wrong direction for the series. Dark Souls 2 is often used as the example of a bad From Software game, and whilst I can agree there are a lot of mechanics implemented here with the sole purpose of making the game harder, they did at least try and balance the difficulty with the introduction of the life gems, and though this ultimately didn't work out, at least there was an attempt to innovate in the series, rather than falling back into tried and tested methods to appeal to the die-hard audience. In order to get things back on track following Dark Souls 2's release in 2014, and subsequent DLCs released later that year, it only took until March of 2015 for From Software to launch a brand new IP and one of my favourite games of all time, Bloodborne. With this being a new IP, Miyazaki was back at the helm, and free to create an entirely new set of mechanics in an entirely new world. Bloodborne takes place in the city of Yharnam, where the old scholars dug too deep in the catacombs, releasing eldritch creatures, wherein using their blood to create miracle medicines turned the once peaceful citizens into disgusting beasts. Heavily inspired by the works of H.P. Lovecraft, Bloodborne adopted a gothic art style with eldritch horror influences alongside an entirely different type of aggressive gameplay. The dodging mechanic, rather than being the standard role of the Souls series, was replaced with the quick step to encourage more rapid and aggressive combat styles, alongside the rally ability. This rally ability allowed players who received a hit from an enemy to recover a significant portion of their health if they attacked the enemy back within a certain time frame. No longer was From Software looking to punish players as much for making mistakes, but they were giving the opportunity to be more reckless and less precise in their actions in order to make the game more accessible and less slow. Shields were also removed from the game, only offering a joke shield, with a larger emphasis on using an old-fashioned gun in order to parry enemy attacks. Largely, this parry system could be ignored in favour of dodging and aggressive attacks, but was still there and hugely overpowered for those willing to learn it. One of the stranger decisions in Bloodborne's game design was the return of finite healing items. What I believed was reintroduced from Demon's Souls to encourage aggressive play and not fear the use of your healing items, the exact same issues found in Demon's Souls were found here. Again, players stuck on bosses or areas were having to repeatedly replay certain sections of the game to farm enemies in order to get souls or direct drops of the healing item, Blood Vials. Whilst Bloodborne did in fact punish you for dying in the same way all of the previous From Software games had, by making you drop all of your XP upon death, there is no curse or hollowing system present in the 2015 ARPG. For the first time in this run of games, there was no true punishment for dying in the game. This aggressive and more forgiving health system, alongside the faster gameplay and horror aesthetics, opened up the Souls games to a wider audience. Alongside being one of the first few noteworthy games for the PS4, it managed to reach the top 12 best-selling games during the PS4's lifespan. For being such a difficult game, it's incredible to see Bloodborne sat amongst games like GTA 5, Marvel's Spider-Man, The Witcher 3, and The Last of Us Part 2. To this day, despite innovating the genre in terms of combat and world design, Bloodborne has yet to see a sequel or even a remaster or port to PC, much to the ire of the fanatical fanbase. This is more than likely due to Sony's involvement in the publishing of the game, but from here we move back to something much more familiar that will become the basis of what I believe to be the most accessible Souls game to date. Widely considered to be the easiest of the Dark Souls trilogy, Dark Souls 3, released in 2016, not only fell back onto the old Dark Souls 1 story, reusing ideas, locations, characters and themes to show what the end of the never-ending cycle looks like, but they fell back into the same mechanics as Dark Souls 1. Set in Lothric rather than Lordran, Dark Souls 3 sees us at the end of the endless cycle of rebirth from the original game, where the fire has been linked so many times only ash remains, and as the nominated Lord has abandoned their duty to link it once more, we, the Ashen One, are tasked with setting things right, learning from the negative reaction to Dark Souls 2, gone were the life gems and bonfire aesthetics, and unlike in Bloodborne, we were back to the standard Estus flasks. This time From Software added in the Ashen Estus flask, in order for spell users to recover mana. Whilst mage builds were already considered to be in easy mode by the hardcore audience, this made spells essentially infinite rather than tied to a specific number of uses per rest at a bonfire. This was of course at the cost of healing Estus flasks, as you only had a number of flasks and you had to find the balance when allocating them. As humanity didn't exist, you couldn't burn any items at a bonfire to allow extra uses of Estus in a specific area. In terms of the hollowing mechanic, From Software removed it entirely. Learning from the positive reception to the accessibility of Bloodborne, you no longer have your health reduce upon death. Instead, you have a regular health bar that you can then enhance further using an Ember, this game's version of humanity. Because you are unkindled instead of the unchosen undead, you don't have the same hollowing curse as everyone else in previous iterations. It appeared following Bloodborne's success that they had learned the key to reaching a wider audience was to make the game less punishing to the average player, while still allowing the hardcore players to carry out as many bespoke difficulty challenges as they wanted to. Jolly Cooperation once again makes a return, allowing you to summon both NPCs and real player characters into the boss fights of Dark Souls 3, which you may feel like you don't even need. The main reason this game is considered the easiest of the series is that whilst the movesets over time have gotten more complicated for the bosses, the community has also gotten significantly better at reading boss tells. You'll also find that due to the Ember mechanic and the fact the Ember item itself can be found everywhere, Dark Souls 3 is incredibly forgiving in boss encounters, with only hidden and DLC bosses like Dark Eater Medea or the Nameless King taking more than a few tries for most players. Following the final DLC for Dark Souls 3 being released in 2017, From Software went quiet for a few years while they developed their most difficult game they've ever created, Sekiro. I don't say this lightly, I do fully believe Sekiro to be the hardest Souls game ever created, mainly because it isn't one. Sekiro is an action game set in the Sengoku period, wherein you play as the Wolf, a disgraced shinobi trained by a true master and charged with protecting the young Lord Kuro. After things inevitably go wrong, the Wolf loses his arm and is granted a new prosthetic arm and dubbed Sekiro. From here, it's up to you to fight through armies, generals, and all manners of twisted creatures in order to save Lord Kuro and break the cycle of immortality. The immortality in question is what gives Sekiro the full game title Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. This is because Sekiro himself is granted immortality, which shows itself gameplay wise by giving you the option to resurrect yourself should you fall in battle. This may lead you to think this would be an easy game by that logic. You get 2 tries at any boss fight? Of course it's easy. Wrong. You'll have noted that when I described the game, I referred to Sekiro as an action game, not an action RPG. This is because you don't create a character with stats, weapons and armor, you're giving the character of Wolf and his trusty katana and are told to get on with it. Like in Bloodborne, there is no real shield, but in Sekiro, the entire game revolves around the parry mechanic. And this is why it's the most difficult game in the series. From Software definitely wanted an authored, curated experience from start to finish that you completed only one way, through learning the fights. Gone is anything that can help you. No bombs, no summons, no overleveling, no switching gear, nothing. You are either going to learn the fight in front of you, or you are not going to complete the game. A brutal mindset to have in a game like this. For the fans obsessed with difficulty, they ate this game up straight away, but for those who enjoyed the previous Souls game's accessibility and were presented with its hard stance, a lot of them bounced off, never to return. I myself had a friend who had this exact same experience. He'd have beaten multiple Souls games, reached Sekiro, and found the rigid playstyle and lack of freedom meant he just couldn't get the combat and bounced off. Once you get it and fully lock in,
What is he doing?
He's beginning to believe.
then Sekiro becomes an incredibly fun and rewarding game. I'd say more so than the mainline Dark Souls titles. And when you beat a boss, you know you mastered it. Repeat playthroughs in my opinion often lose their luster with the lack of build variety, but it's still a fantastic game. The one thing that always puzzles me is why they made it so inaccessible after the progress they'd made from Dark Souls 3. Following Sekiro, the most inaccessible of the From Software titles, Miyazaki created what many believe to be the pinnacle of the Souls series, Elden Ring. Smashing records worldwide and taking Game of the Year at the Game Awards over God of War Ragnarok, Elden Ring could best be described as a phenomenon back in 2022. Everyone was playing it, even my wife's granddad was playing it, and cited its accessibility as the main draw of the game. With the world built by George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones fame, From Software had created the very first open world Souls game. You star as a Tarnished, someone who used to have the grace of gold, long lost, and your mission is to make it back to the Erdtree to become Elden Lord. Returning to the action RPG genre, we return to the custom-made characters and stats alongside hundreds of weapons and armor sets. Alongside this, we get Ashes of War to customize weapon skills, and the over 100 spells to play around with. On top of the usual summons returning, we also get something wholly unique to Elden Ring, which upon release was a bit of a sore point for the Git Gooders amongst the community, the Spirit Ashes. Throughout the world you can find summonable Spirit Ashes, which essentially are enemies or elite warriors fighting alongside you in battle. Whilst they are restricted only to certain areas, the key places players find the most use for them are in boss arenas. These spirits not only help inflict damage on the boss, but they also draw aggro away from the player, meaning if you get a tanky enough spirit and upgrade it, you can more or less have them do the fight for you, whilst you do as much damage as possible from the sidelines. And I'd be remiss to talk about Spirit Ashes without mentioning the infamous Mimic Tier spirit. This spirit mimicked your exact loadout essentially allowing you to have two of yourself in any given boss battle. The important distinction to make here is that using spirits does not increase the boss health like summoning a player or NPC would, so you essentially get a co-op ally with none of the drawbacks. Don't get me wrong, From Software definitely adjusted the boss fights to accommodate for this, in some cases having bosses flanked with enemies or having particularly aggressive phases and insane attack delays, but oftentimes these spirits could bypass the real difficulty at play. This was what made the Git Gud crowd so angry at them. They believed the true challenge lay in not using them. Something else which led to the accessibility of Elden Ring was the world design. With some exceptions, the majority of main areas and bosses which resided in them could be tackled in any order at any time. If you found yourself stuck on a particular boss, you could just leave, go and explore more of the world, maybe find materials to upgrade your weapon or spirit ash, or even just go fight other bosses and level up. It was this freedom which allowed Elden Ring to excel far beyond what the Souls series had previously achieved, as you were almost never hard stuck on a boss. There was always something else to do or somewhere else to go. This was something only the open world element of the game could achieve, and I'd argue From Software would lose players if they went back to their linear design in a future game. In terms of the gameplay mechanics, we did return to the standard 2 flask system we saw in Dark Souls 3, where we had to balance our health versus mana flasks. That being said, we also got an extremely overpowered system that a lot of people, including myself, ignored at the first glance: the crafting system. In the old games of the series, an item like a firebomb was typically finite. You could buy some to help out with a boss, but there was no guarantee you'd have enough to see the end of the fight. Here in Elden Ring, farming materials in the world allow you to essentially make infinite amounts of various reusable pots, for pure damage like fire pots, to the more unique forms like poison, holy, or sleep pots. These pots can turn the tide of a battle, and with their abundance, you can tell From Software really wanted you to engage with this system. With all of these additional features added to the patented Souls formula, even the quote-unquote casual gamers felt like they could thrive in the lands between. And yes, in a lot of cases the bosses were harder than those found in Dark Souls 3, there were more than enough accessibility features that you could navigate each of the challenges you were presented with and really go down this route that Miyazaki and his team had been refining for years, to create your own level of challenge and difficulty. So here we are, having talked about the individual games in the Soulsborne Sekiro Ring set of games that From Software set out to perfect back in 2009. We've seen the series go from an inaccessible prepare-to-die meme with obtuse systems and difficulty spikes to something that even the casual player can enjoy. Are these games for everyone? No, not yet. But would it be a bad thing if they were? Oftentimes the hardcore community will shout down those for discussing an easy mode for the game, but it looks as though FromSoft are actively bringing it in right under our noses, and the games are better for it. At no point should people be complaining about options, and that's all these innovative systems added over the years have become: options. Would the series have seen such a rise in mainstream popularity if it was always dubbed a hard game? Sure, the fanatics would always be there, but would your elderly dad be sat there at dinner saying how he beat Godric the Grafted in his 10th try? I'd wager not. Then do you need a Git Gud? If you'd asked me back in 2009, I'd say yes, 100%, and From Software thinks so too. With their game design being so hostile to new players, it would certainly be considered unwelcoming today. After all these innovations spanning 15 years, do you need a Git Gud now? No, definitely not. We can see in the evolution of the series over time that Miyazaki and the team actively want more people engaging with the piece of art they've created. They love to hear the stories of people overcoming adversity by getting help from any means, and there's no way they'd want to see less sales because they've made a less accessible game. Whether the incentive is financial or just wanting to share their art with the world, the days of getting good are far from over, but they've given you the tools to set your own level of difficulty, to be as hardcore as you want. The most important thing is to respect the rest of your fellow community. There will always be god tier players who do the whole thing at Soul Level 1 with nothing but a loincloth on, but that doesn't diminish what you accomplish with all the spirit ashes, summons and crafted pots you want. You've achieved what you set out to do, and so did they, and one shouldn't look negatively upon the other because you're all sharing the artistic vision of From Software together, and that's what art is all about. And that concludes another deep dive into the world of gaming. Do you agree that we no longer need to get good? This has been a bone of contention in the community for years, so if you want a debate, feel free down in the comments, but please keep it respectful. If you're liking this new long form series, feel free to like and share. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, leave them down in the comments as I do read them all. And finally, if you want to come chat with me, you can find me over at x.com/gracious_rhino. I'm Gracious Rhino, look after each other, and I'll catch you soon.